So, welcome everyone to today's Controlling Your Feral Pigs webinar, brought to you by Leading Sheep and Making More from Sheep. Today we will hear from Jason Wishart from Invasive Animals CRC. Jason has worked with Invasive Animals CRC for 6 years. During this time, his focus has largely been feral pig research, either into product development or ecology and management. So, nothing further from me, and I'll hand it over to you, Jason. Thank you.
G'day everyone. Just wanted to start by saying thanks for joining up today. It's fantastic to see so many online. This is the first webinar I've actually done, so you might have to bear with me a little bit. So today we'll be talking about feral pig management in Australia with a little bit more of a focus on Queensland, I guess. And as Alex mentioned, my name is Jason Wishart, and I'm a Field Research Officer for the Invasive Animals CRC, and I have been for quite some time now. And I've been doing plenty of work on feral pigs all over the country. I'd also like to start by just running through a few acknowledgements. For one, I'd like to thank MLA, who's a partner of ours, and Animal Control Technologies Australia, who provide funding and support, and also the Australian Government. And I'd also like to thank current colleagues that I work with, which is Simon Humphries and Paul Meek, as well as past colleagues too, Dr. Stephen Lappage, who no longer works at the Invasive Animals CRC, but had plenty to do with feral pig research. So anyway, I'll just make a bit of a start and we'll run through it and we'll see how we go. Okay, so feral pigs in Australia. So they've been present here since early European settlement. They're initially concentrated around settlement areas, but they've since spread throughout a majority, or almost 40% of the mainland. This is through illegal and an accidental translocation. A lot of these have dispersed through and along waterways, and you can see there the map of Australia with some of the heavier infestations being in those sort of west areas. In 1990, Jim Hone estimated there to be between 3.5 and 23 million feral pigs in Australia. So that's a confidence interval estimate. So, the density should fall somewhere in between there. They occupy a wide range of habitats throughout Australia, from the really sort of arid zones, where I've been doing some work currently in central New South Wales, which is sort of mallee climate, through to the alpine and even the wet tropics in North Queensland. But food, water and shelter are key factors to their survival. And the importance of those, I guess, depends on the situation at hand. In a lot of situations, shelter becomes the most important, particularly in really hot conditions, because pigs will travel a long way overnight to access water, up to 10 kilometres in some circumstances. But if they can't escape the heat during the day, they'll die of heat exhaustion quickly. The home range varies according to body size and gender, as well as resource density. So larger pigs, they need more food, so they need to cover more area to gather those resources. Gender, so males have larger home ranges than the females, and that's probably to do with their larger body size, but also because sows have small home ranges, the boars want to, I guess, travel throughout the landscape to service as many of those as possible. Sows have an average of about 6 piglets per year in each litter. Sometimes this can be up as high as 12 piglets depending on seasonal conditions, and they can also have up to 2 litters per year, which shows how quickly their numbers can jump. The diet of feral pigs, they're an omnivore, but they have a bit of a preference towards green vegetation when it's available. So when after heavy rains, they'll go for the green, actively growing vegetation, which is also high in protein, which is what they require for population recovery. They'll also chase lambs as well during lambing times, and studies have shown that up between 30 and 40% of lambs are taken by feral pigs. They rarely leave any signs at all of predation. Particularly with lambs, you may find a skull or hooves or some wool, but it's sometimes can be difficult to determine what's actually taking the lambs. But if there's no sign at all, a lot of the time that's pigs. As well, they'll eat roots and bulbs and things, and this normally happens when the active growing grasses begin to hay off. They'll start digging and chasing roots and things like that. They have a lesser quality, so that's why they're sort of a secondary source. The eggs of ground nesting birds as well is an issue, as well as reptiles too. So things like ground nesting turtles, for instance, earthworms and other invertebrates that live under the soil surface. Feral pigs will turn over massive areas in search of food overnight and can cause considerable damage. And then you've got carrion consumption as well, so they'll eat dead lambs, sheep, and I guess cattle and all sorts of things if they can find it, and other food scarce. So some of the things to look for to determine whether you have feral pigs perhaps on your property if you're new to this. A lot of people already know what signs to look for, but some may not, so I'll just quickly run through it. A lot of the time you'll find regular travel pads. Pigs use the same pad often to go to water or to go to favourite feeding grounds and things like that. So a lot of the time if you find these well-worn pads, you can have a look and you can find droppings on there. You can also find tusking and all sorts of things. So the other thing too to look at in drier areas is wallows and tree rubs and tracks around dams and things. So if you come up to a dam, you can walk around the edge and you'll find wallows where pigs will wallow sort of in the warm conditions for thermoregulation, as they don't have sweat glands, so they need to cool off. But they also wallow to relieve parasite infection as well. So you can find wallows in cooler conditions. Day camp, that's where the animals normally camp up during the day to escape the heat, and they'll often use the same one regularly until they're disturbed from that site. So if you can find those, it's a good spot to, I guess, target some control. Dung and ground rooting. Several studies have shown wherever there's fresh dung and fresh ground rooting, the chances of baiting and trapping success increase. Carrion consumption, as I mentioned earlier, we find that some animals start to get consumed relatively quickly by feral pigs, and holes under fences are another one as well. It's quite often, so the pigs will start the damage, but then it's often used by a number of other animals as well. So it can be expensive, and it can also increase the chances of sheep roaming onto next door neighbours' properties and cross-contamination and all those sorts of things. So that brings us to the impacts, I guess, of agriculture. Back in '82, it was estimated that feral pigs cause around $100 million worth of damage. This is probably likely to be much greater in current climates. As mentioned, they'll prey on newborn lambs. They wallow where cattle and sheep and all sorts of things drink, which is a huge disease risk. They damage crops by consuming them and just trampling them, smash through fences, and also wallow in dams. Some of the diseases that are commonly carried by feral pigs in Australia are leptospirosis, also brucellosis, and Q fever. Some of these, well, all of those can be also transmitted to humans, so it's quite a concern. And then you have the environmental impacts, which are a little bit more difficult to quantify, I guess, because you can't, I suppose, put a dollar value on it, and we don't know often how many of these, I guess, endangered species are actually out there and things. But feral pigs have been shown to dig up threatened species in Cape York, the nest of ground nesting sea turtles. So there was a study just recently published, this year actually, that showed that 40% of sea turtle nests were damaged, and that 89% of that damage was caused by feral pigs, which is quite high and quite concerning. And then you've got other things too, like frogs, threatened frogs and ground nesting birds. They'll also, during ground rooting, change the soil layer and composition, which can alter habitat structure. And they often target riparian zones, which is also valuable habitat for many other native species. Because of the environmental damages, feral pigs have been listed as a key threatening process to their survival under the Threatened Species Environment Conservation Act, or EPBC Act, sorry. So this is largely by predation. habitat degradation, competition, and disease transmission. So what do we have to manage them? There's a number of things that we use to manage feral pigs in Australia, and all have their pros and cons. So I'll just run through them all, and then I'll go through a bit more of the management side of it and what you might do in certain situations. So trapping is effective for harvesting, but not really for population level control, and it is labour intensive. It might also be good in areas where there may be risk to non-target species with poisoning. Fencing is another one, so exclusion fencing. It's good for small areas of high value, so high value crops, etc., or even perhaps lambing paddocks. But it costs a fair bit, and it's also costly to prepare, but also costly to maintain. Aerial shooting is another one that's often undertaken in sort of remote areas. It's effective for rapid population reductions, although it gets expensive when pig numbers are low, and it's hard to implement in some terrain. So where it's heavily forested, it's difficult to see the animals from the air. They're not so useful in those situations, but in others. Ground shooting as well. It's pretty common, a popular recreational activity. It's useful for removing some animals, but it is labour intensive, but often the costs are really a non-issue because the hunters, etc., are quite keen to do it. They do it for fun. But it is limited in effectiveness when pigs are at high densities. So if you've got a mob of 10 to 15 or even up to 30 in some circumstances, it's very unlikely that all those pigs will be removed, and then we leave educated animals in the environment. So then we've got biological control, which is another one, but there are significant risks to the domestic pork industry, which is worth like $1 billion in Australia. So it's really not a possibility at this point in time, because things that would affect feral pigs would also affect domestic. Fertility control has been looked at, but at the moment there are no bait-delivered contraceptives available. People are still looking into it at the moment, but in the US that's been shelved. Next is dogging. There are welfare concerns with the use of hunting dogs for feral pig control. Can be useful for removing animals at low density, although when the numbers are high, the same as ground shooting, it can be ineffective because a lot of animals are left. And then poisoning. It's cost effective for large population reductions, although there are target specificity and animal welfare issues associated with its use. Now, I just want to mention too that there's a practical guide for feral pig control in Queensland that was written by Jim Mitchell, and there's the web address of that document there, and it runs through a lot of these things that I'm talking about in more detail. So it's well worth it, well worth getting your hands on a copy of that. And the other thing too, at the moment, the Invasive Animals CRC are working on a glove box guide for feral pig control. We've already produced similar ones for rabbits and foxes, so yeah, hopefully in the not too distant future that will be available also. So it's something that you can put in the glove box and pull it out, and it's sort of like a step-by-step guide. So the management decisions. So we have all these things that we can do, but then it comes down to how do we go about doing it the best way possible. It's important during control programs to coordinate your efforts with neighbours as much as you can. The larger the area that you target, the less or the slower the reinvasion rate. They should also encompass multiple techniques, because every technique, as I mentioned earlier, has their shortfalls, and some pigs will be missed with each technique, and hopefully what you missed with one you'll pick up with the next. It's also very important to implement each technique when it's going to be most cost effective. So it's no good implementing poison baiting when there's plenty of alternative food around and plenty of alternate water, because it's difficult to target. So in those conditions, aerial shooting might be best. But when times dry out and there is limited alternative food, then poisoning might be a better way to go. So there's some basic management steps that have been developed over the past, I think, nearly 20 years. It's been refined over the years, but Mike Brasher mentioned these in the early days and they've been worked on ever since. But the first thing to do in any pest management program is to define the problem. And it's not that the pest animal that's the problem. What we've got to look at it more so is the damage that it's causing, because that's measurable, and that then we can measure the reduction in those damages based on our control efforts. So as an example, I'm doing some work in central New South Wales, and there are a number of feral pigs living in Malleefowl habitat, and the problem is Malleefowl mound destruction by feral pigs. So I guess that's what we're looking at, and then we hope our control efforts will increase the number of active Malleefowl mounds. So then you've got to determine the management priorities. What's important in the area? What would you like to conserve? Those sorts of things, because it may not be financially viable to target the whole area. Then maybe you may be able to focus more specifically on, say, cropping areas or whatever it might be that you're trying to protect. Then you want to decide on the feasibility, the costs associated and all those sorts of things. Determine some clear measurable objectives so you can actually see whether you're meeting these objectives over time or whether something needs to be done. So once you've got all that, then you can start to develop a program, and that's, like I said earlier, coordinate with neighbours, work out when things should be implemented, what's the most suitable time, what's the most suitable technique available for this particular area, and then you implement the program, and all the while you should be monitoring and evaluating its success. It's also a good idea before you do any control whatsoever to get a bit of baseline information that you can compare to throughout the years of the project, and then you can monitor it, as I said, evaluate it, refine if necessary, or keep going if it's working. So now I'm just going to move on to some of the work that we've been doing here at the Invasive Animals CRC over the years. So I'll talk a bit about the population genetic studies that we've done, the development of PIGOUT, which is manufactured feral pig bait, also the development of HogHopper, which is another manufactured feral pig bait with an alternative toxin, the HogHopper, which is a bait delivery device that's specific to feral pig, PIGOUT econobait, which is a smaller bait and hopefully a little bit cheaper, but that'll be mainly to be used in the HogHopper. And then some ecology and management projects that I've been working on. As I mentioned earlier, the one in central New South Wales, and there was also one in the Macquarie Marshes. So the genetic studies. We wanted to determine the effect of aerial shooting on population genetics of feral pigs. So selected a management area that was 4,000 square metres, which this was undertaken in Queensland actually. And we wanted to determine that population size of feral pigs out there, the genetic population size I should say, and whether there are any boundaries, so what limits pigs from dispersing throughout the landscape. But we also collected samples over 500,000 square kilometres to determine whether those population boundaries exceeded the 4,000 square metre mark. So what we found were feral pig populations were able to return to pre-control levels after 1 year. So that was the aerial. We did an aerial shooting program within that 4,000 square metre area, and what we found were that they came back to that initial population. We also found that the population was genetically identical to those removed, so we actually weren't targeting the whole population, and as soon as you moved out that chunk, the rest move in, and as I said, the same genetic population reinvaded the area. And it was found that migration was typically along waterways, which has been common and has been noted in many other studies. So that there sort of shows that the importance of coordinating over a massive area if you can, because reinvasion is going to occur, and the smaller the area, the quicker that happens. And what you hope to do is target a full genetic population. That means there won't be reinvasion. So genetics are becoming used more and more in wildlife research these days because the price is coming down a little bit, and it can be applied to situations like this. And there's a bit of a map of the area that was used in the study, and the black part there is where the actual property was that received aerial shooting, and you can see that little boundary around it is the actual identified size of the population, and that little square or that little area in the middle is just a small component of that. So the development of PIGOUT, the idea of this was to develop a product that was target-specific, user-friendly, that could be purchased by people wherever they're dealing with feral pig problems. The project commenced during 2004. Several prototypes were created, and of those, they were all tested in a range of different settings, pen and paddock trials, and of those we found that the omnivorous sausage bait was the favourite of the lot. So a series of target specificity trials were also undertaken to determine, so these were using just purely the bait without the poison in it, just to find out what other animals were interested in this bait. And it was actually found using a series of remote cameras and things that these were quite target specific to feral pigs. There are a few omnivores that have sampled this bait, but the good thing about it is it contains, the live bait contains the toxic core, which you can see there in the picture, just here. So that's where the 1080 is. So if you get any animals come along, they can sample, so things like possums and that, but they won't actually reach that core, whereas pigs often do. So once we identified the right bait and that it was target specific, they had to implement a series of large-scale field trials in a number of different habitats, which you can see over here where the trials were undertaken, to determine its field efficacy. So to achieve that, we had to reduce pig numbers by 75%, or the population by 75%. So initially there was a free feeding stage where all bait stations were monitored using cameras, and there was a whole range of other techniques used as well for monitoring, including satellite tracking collars, etc. And then after about a week of free feeding, we got an idea of feral pig numbers, and then after that, the poisoning was undertaken, and then we could determine the percent reduction. And it was quite successful, this process, and the product, as a result, was launched during 2008, which is Australia's first feral pig or manufactured feral pig bait. The other thing we wanted to do was to develop a bait with a new active, because poisoning is one of the most efficient techniques for controlling feral pigs in Australia, although some of the current toxins are not ideal. So 1080, the death between 4 and 20 hours, it's a non-selective toxin at the feral pig dose. Feral pigs require about a 72 milligram dose, which is quite high compared to, say, a fox or a dog bait, which is a fox bait 3 and a pig bait maybe 6. There is no antidote, and it also is restricted access. So it's difficult to get your hands on the toxin unless you have all the right training and qualifications, and you've got to buy that by authorised personnel. So normally government agencies prepare that. Yellow phosphorus is another one, or SAP. There's a fair bit of controversy about the use of SAP, largely to do with the humaneness. It can take up to 2 to 4 days for an animal to go down with SAP. The symptoms are supposedly quite inhumane, and it's another non-selective toxin. And it's a residual toxin, so it lasts in the environment for quite a while, so it can get passed down the food chain. The other one is warfarin. It's been used in a few programs, mostly in the ACT and in the Macquarie National Park. It's quite effective on feral pigs, but again considered relatively inhumane because the death takes so long. So, and that's an anticoagulant, and it causes internal bleeding. So there, as mentioned, I guess not ideal for feral pig control. Well, it was actually Brennan Cowlin did a Achilles heel review of potential alternate toxins on feral pigs, so talent toxins and weaknesses in feral pigs as part of his PhD. Found that sodium nitrite was quite a target to the methemoglobin levels in feral pigs, and they're susceptible to that mode of action. And sodium nitrite is a common food preservative, so there's quite a lot of information available on the toxin itself. And as mentioned, it prevents the red blood cells from carrying oxygen throughout the body. So this depletes oxygen to organs like the brain and the heart, which causes relatively quick death. And as mentioned, pigs are relatively inefficient compared to other animals at counteracting this process. There are limited symptoms. Death can take up to 1.5 hours. Normally the first hour or so there is no visual symptoms at all, and then they go downhill really fast after that. And there is an antidote, methylene blue, which can counteract this process. So we have, initially there were a number of pen trials on the product to work out what would work best, all those sorts of things, and we developed a prototype bait and then went out and did some field trials. The field trials generally last for 3 to 4 weeks. Initially start with some free feeding, getting the pigs used to congregating in a particular area, and then that's followed by a toxic baiting phase. During that time there's plenty of monitoring going on. Bait take, individuals at bait stations using remote cameras, and also remote cameras just placed throughout the landscape at dams and things. So far, these up here in the corner you can see where we've done trials, and the average feeding population knockdown is around about 82%, which is quite good. The only problem is we're having trouble with the long-term stability of sodium nitrite at the moment, and we're currently working on the formulation to increase that, so that's still a while off. So can't really give any dates here on when this may be available, but all I can say is we're working on it and we're getting closer. Now the HogHopper, which is a product that I guess came about through pig work in the Daintree area, where there was a large number of non-target species in that area, and we sort of thought of an idea that it would be great if we could exclude non-target animals from getting access to poison bait, and quickly learnt that something of that nature would be very good also in a number of other areas. And also if it could hold a large amount of bait, you could put it in areas that you don't have to go visit every day, which would be fantastic. So we implemented a few proof of concept pen trials and found that it worked quite well. And then once we did that, we did a paddock enclosure pen trial. So that was 10 wild-caught feral pigs in a large enclosure. And we placed them into the large enclosure, and then we placed a HogHopper in that enclosure and loaded it with 1080 PIGOUT baits. And after one visit to the device, all 10 animals were found dead in the pen over subsequent hours. So thereafter we went to the field to make sure that it would also work in the field as well as the pen. So first of all we did some non-toxic field trials to determine what other animals may in fact get into the device. We found it was relatively target specific in most areas, although wild dogs did consume bait from a hopper up in North Queensland, so we did have to modify the design from push doors to lift doors. So over the life of the HogHopper it has evolved considerably, but now it's fantastic, lightweight, portable, user-friendly, all the things that it needs to be. So we did a toxic field trial and it worked incredibly well with poison grain, so 1080 poison grain as well as PIGOUT. And after that we went for the national tender process to try and identify a manufacturer who could make the best quality product for the cheapest price. We appointed 2, one in Queensland, one in South Australia. Han Steel and Plasteel are the manufacturers of that, but they're sold through Animal Control Technologies in Melbourne, who also sell PIGOUT and numerous other products. It was released in March 2011, and now ACRC have sold over 300 units Australia-wide, which is a fantastic result. The PIGOUT Econobait, the idea of this came about once the HogHopper had been developed. So previously we had to have a large PIGOUT bait with the core for target specificity reasons, but now we have a HogHopper to prevent animals or non-target animals from accessing the bait, which would reduce its size, which was a key to the target specificity of the larger PIGOUT bait, sorry. And we also could remove the central core so that 1080 is dispersed evenly throughout the bait, which is another process that helps with the expense of the product. And as mentioned, it's purely for delivery in the HogHopper to reduce risk to non-target species. We implemented the trial in Dirranbandi, Queensland, and it was highly successful. So that, again, similar process as the previous trials. And Yeah, we were able to knock down 78% of feeding animals, and it was a reasonably large population, so it was 134 feeding to begin with. We knocked that population down by 78%. I think on the first night of poison baiting, up to around 700 baits were consumed, so we could put that down to lethal doses. So we're hoping again, not quite sure when that will be ready because it's got to go through the registration process, but it is something that may be out in the future. And then trials in the USA. We're working with some US partners at the moment on the development of sodium nitrite and HogHopper, but also the HogHopper. The HogHopper is being tested in these states here, mostly in Texas, where they've got large feral pig numbers, because in America, feral pigs populations are exploding, and they actually don't poison bait feral pigs at the moment, so the populations have spread significantly. They're nearly present now in all states, but the only way they'll ever be able to bait feral pigs over there is to have a target-specific bait delivery device due to the abundance of non-target omnivores, and the HogHopper may be just a thing for that. So we've been working closely with those guys over there on that, and so far it's working really well. As you can see up here, one of the main species is raccoon. They have gotten into the device, but we're working on ways to figure that out. A majority don't, but one animal did. The other animal that I guess would be a concern is black bear. They're a very big, strong animal. They may be able to get into the device, but we may be able to look into things to avoid that. So timing of baiting, so when bears are hibernating, those sorts of things. And these are the sort of projects, I guess, that I've been working on, where we're trying to incorporate some of these things, some of these products into real management situations, and also just to learn a bit more about feral pigs. So the Macquarie Marshes project was a CFOP project, and it was 3 years. It was a large project between multiple organisations, which was the Central West Catchment Management Authority, Northwest and Central West LHPA, and the Invasive Animals CRC. And the objective was to protect the Ramsar wetlands from feral pig damage. There are a number of migratory birds who use the site for breeding and things like that. So our component was to study the diet of feral pigs, get a bit more of an understanding, some of the activity patterns, which we did via remote cameras, bait attractants, so what works there, because it's quite a difficult area to bait feral pigs because resources are often quite abundant. And we also did some work on the genetics as well of feral pigs, like what is the size of the area that we need to target the entire genetic population. And all this was condensed down to management objectives to work out how we might be able to manage feral pigs better in that particular area. So that worked really well. It was a good study, and we found that feral pigs were mostly nocturnal in the area, regardless of management actions that were being undertaken. So even if aerial shooting was undertaken, or if there was no management undertaken, feral pigs were mostly nocturnal, particularly during warmer months. The diet, again, confirmed very similar to elsewhere, that they did consume animal material, but it was low at the time. So that was mostly things like frogs. Also found snakes in the diet as well. The other thing, we tried several different bait attractants. Of those, there was molasses, caraway, vanilla, a number of different things, and found that a few showed some promise, but more work is required with higher sample sizes, etc., to provide anything, well, results of statistical significance. But there were a few standouts, which were caraway, molasses, and fermented grain. So that was all quite interesting. And then, as I mentioned, the Malleefowl project, it's a 3-year biodiversity fund project. We're working with the Lachlan CMA National Parks and Wildlife Service, and also many surrounding landholders. You can see there's an image of the site here. This is all remnant mallee runs through private land, which joins to the national park down the bottom. So Malleefowl exist here, and they exist right throughout here. And what we're hoping to do is to develop a predator management program through this area, and also on surrounding properties, to help reduce the pressures on Malleefowl so that they can actually get some recruitment into the breeding population. A study has shown that possibly as high as 90% of Malleefowl chicks are taken by things like foxes. And also, as I mentioned earlier, that pigs will eat the eggs of ground nesting species like turtles and things like that. So it's highly possible that they're going to be doing the same thing to Malleefowl. And there's a picture of some pigs investigating a Malleefowl mound during that project. So with any luck, we'll be able to find something that actually works. So it's very similar to this whole management thing where we work out what would be best suited at what time, get the coordination of it all going, we identify what the problem is, and we hope to increase the Malleefowl population by a certain percentage. So that's nearly it from me, actually. These are some of the feral pig pest smart products that have been developed over time to help people with the management of feral pigs that have been developed by the CRC. So we've got some general information there. We've got some information on HogHopper, etc. Some previous things. We've also got a number of case studies that you may be able to, I guess, apply to certain situations, or at least use as a little bit of a guide. So yeah, that's really about it from me, and I'll pass it over to Alex.
Righto, thank you, Jason. That was very good.
No problem.
So we've got a few questions coming in. So the first one is, at what age can pigs reproduce?
It depends normally. So it can be to do with the body weight and the condition of the animal as well. So a sow, for instance, so a small female at around about 25 to 30 kilograms, they can reproduce. So yeah, so 25 to 30 kilograms, which also generally happens within about the first 6 to 8 months of age, whereas adult, well, boars are a little bit different, so they take just a little bit longer. So yeah, what you can see there is a sow can have a number of piglets, and within 6 months, those piglets can reproduce. So you can see how quickly numbers can build.
Righto, very good. Do all pigs kill lambs, or is killing confined to just the boars?
There was a study undertaken by Jim Hone in the where was that? Nyngan area of New South Wales, and he found that boars were more likely to prey on newborn lambs, but it's not restricted to large adult boars. All adult sows will do the same as well, and numerous other pigs have been found to do it, but it seems to be a little bit more prevalent in the adult boars.
All right, very good. We do have a couple of hands raised, I think, still. Yeah, we do. So I'll just unmute Richard Bucknell. He's got a question to ask you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Dick Bucknell here. As you know, I'm involved with CWSP, and I would like to correct a few things that were said there about phosphorus poisoning. The humanity side of it is never been compared with 1080. In actual fact, we firmly believe that 1080 is less humane than phosphorus poisoning. There is no secondary poisoning, and I would like to say that particularly in the Macquarie Marshes, there are a lot of HogHoppers left in the paddock, and I know it's not quite right, but we've had a huge inquiry from that area for the poison after these, and also in the Durham-Bandy district after these things. You know, I know there is a big question of this, but I don't think that if we're going to combat the wild pig, that then there should be an open mind as far as phosphorus poisoning, because otherwise it's just being sidelined the whole time.
Yeah, so I guess it's not really a question, more of a statement. And
Yep.
I can see that a lot of landholders out there are strongly believe that phosphorus should be still available. I must say I have not had too much to do with it. I'm only going by what has been said to me and by the literature. But it would be interesting, I believe, if there was a comparative study to determine the effectiveness of phosphorus against other toxins out there. and I guess that it's been taken off the market in New South Wales at the moment, which is something that we can't do much about. But I guess it's still available in Queensland, is it? Is that right? I'm not sure. Anyway, if it's still available in Queensland, I think it would be a good idea to compare the effects of it against some of the more recognised techniques.
Yeah. No, I mean, lots of people are actually doing the comparisons at the moment, and our results, the results or the reports that we're getting back are good. You know, it's one of these things that we don't want to raise too many issues, particularly in the wider field, because pigs are a major problem. Poisoning, to me, I don't enjoy, but if we're going to protect the environment and the production of the land, then unfortunately we have to use every tool available.
I think it does come at a price, and I think it has to be done as humanely and as big as possible, and that's the idea of the Invasive Animals CRC, is to ensure that that is the case. But yeah, I think this is just
Jason, can I make one comment? One of these false impressions is that it burns the guts out of the animals it's eating, you know, just because there's phosphine gas which is given off. Everybody gets absolutely hysterical about that. It is never, it doesn't burn inside the pig at all, and there is no secondary poison. It is a corrosion which is a lot less painful than warfarin particularly, and we believe is a lot less painful than 1080. Warfarin is the worst, then 1080, and we're actually finding that, mate, if you've got to die anything. Guys out west in New South Wales always told me that if they had to put something on their Wheaties, they'd put phosphorus on it rather than anything else any day of the week. So anyway, I've said enough now anyway.
I'm not sure if it's true or not, but you have to be careful of fires with phosphorus when baiting with phosphorus, because it can ignite grass, etc.
Righto.
Yeah, I think we'll get bogged down on that. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and it is peddled about. That's the major problem. Yeah. Okay. I'll shut up now.
That's all right. Thank you, Richard. We do appreciate your comments, and yeah, thank you for that discussion. So we'll keep going through some of the more the questions we've got. We've still got a few to get through. There's another one is why the need for pre-feeding with the HogHopper? If the pig is attracted and eats the bait, then it's dead. Doesn't need to be attracted again. So is the pre-feeding essential and in the training process, Jason?
Absolutely, yeah. So initially, during the initial stages of the HogHopper, we never planned to have a free feeding component at all. We wanted to be able to just put the device out, closed in the ready to go position, and have pigs just wander along and use it whenever they came across it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Pigs are very smart animals, and they do learn. They need to learn. So what we do is we free feed as many of the animals as we can in an area, in a particular area. The free feeding process also helps with attracting pigs from a wider area. Rather than poisoning, within a couple of days, you might only have half the population there. The longer the free feeding is extended, I guess, the more likely you are to target a wider population when you put poison in. So yeah, it's essential for getting them to learn how to lift the door with their snout, because it provides them with a little bit of an access point. But what you want to do is make sure they're all feeding before you set it to the poison stage, because otherwise you'll have half the animals get poison and new ones come along who haven't visited the device before and don't know how to use it. And then they won't be able to figure out how to get in there. So that's really the reasoning behind why there is a free feed stage. One, because it's essential during any poison baiting. For free feeding, it just, like I said, it attracts animals from the larger areas, and also because it's meant, like we just had to do it. We found in all the studies that free feeding is essential. They won't learn how to get into it. The odd one might, but most of them will not get into it unless they've been shown.
Okay, another question here. Nola Dempsey's got his hand raised, so I'll unmute Noel and he can ask you his question. All right, Noel?
Yep. Thanks, Alex. Jason, I've got a couple of questions. The first one is that if fresh green feed is available, will feral pigs still kill lambs? And the second one was some work done by the DPI at Charleville probably 20, 25 years ago highlighted the importance of starting debate for feral pigs about 1 month ahead of lambing. I really can't see a reason why that should be, but my question is, can you think of any reasons in the biology of the pig why you should start baiting about 1 month ahead of lambing?
Okay, well, the first one I'll go to, which was whether feral pigs will still eat lambs with green picks available. It's highly possible that they will, because it's a high protein source, the lamb. Probably more likely in drier conditions, but I still imagine that they would when conditions are green, because they need, like I mentioned earlier, they need that high protein for reproduction, so they'll be chasing lambs, and they probably seem to be a bit of a favoured food source. And I think the reason behind baiting prior to lambing is, first of all, there'll be less alternate food available. So what will happen if you try and bait during lambing, the lambs are already available, so then it's going to be difficult to coax the animals onto a bait that they're not necessarily familiar with when they're already eating that high quality food of lamb. But the other thing too is you want to reduce the pig numbers before the lambs hit the ground, so you reduce that predation rate in advance as well. So, you know, pig numbers are already low when lambing starts. So then you're losing fewer, rather than trying to combat the problem, I guess, once it's already occurred. Try and preempt, you know, when's the best time. And it's the same with cropping too. If there's vulnerable stages in a crop cycle, you want to jump in and get rid of the pigs before the damage happens, I guess. So that's probably I would imagine the main reason is that there's probably less food available at the time, and also to have fewer pigs in the landscape when the lambs are hitting the ground, because there are a few studies out there that have shown that feral pigs, lamb predation is higher with an increased density of feral pigs as well. So yeah, high pig numbers mean higher levels of predation. And the other thing too, if you're not scanning your ewes or anything, people may not know how many are having twin lambs, all those sorts of things, and twin lambs are 6 times more likely to be preyed on by feral pigs than single lambs. So, you know, it might get 100% lambing rate or whatever, but it may have been much higher than that. But without scanning, you would never know. So that's about it, yeah. Hope that helps.
It's Noel here again. I didn't express myself well. The point in the work that was done in Charleville was that programs that started more than a month ahead of lambing were much more efficient than programs that started in the weeks ahead of lambing. The only reason I can see for that is that maybe the program continues for 4 weeks instead of, say, 2 weeks. Can you think of any other reason why that might be so?
It might be to do with seasonal conditions. I'm not quite sure when lambs are hitting the ground at that time, but maybe 1 month prior it was drier, hotter and drier, and less alternate food available. That might be a reason, because baiting is far more effective when there are less alternate feed, so that might be one thing. And you're quite right too, that the amount of time you can put into control would be a factor, I imagine. So normally the longer the free feed period, the more feral pigs you'll attract to a station, the more that will be exposed to your control effort. So you shorten that period of time, only maybe 50% of the animals in that region might have found a bait station. And if you put the poison out there, those 50% are still going to be wandering around, whereas if you extend it for a little bit longer, you may attract 80% perhaps. So yeah, the extended free feeding, again, is essential. I think there's a minimum requirement of 3 days, but I always go for longer than that if I can, just to make sure.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Noel. Jason, another question is, with the omnivore sausage, could pigs eat more than one?
Yes, they often do, particularly during free feeding, and that's the same with any bait. During free feeding, that the animals will often eat more because there's no toxin in it, I guess, and they don't feel the effects. So they may eat, I've seen pigs eat up to 5 free feeding PIGOUT baits, but generally when the bait contains toxin, they eat much less than that. But still there is a possibility of multiple baits, yes, especially larger pigs. They may eat, 2 to 3 perhaps before feeling a bit sick or whatever and wandering off. So you always want to make sure during baiting that there's plenty of poison bait out there, of course adhering to government legislation and all those sorts of things, just to make sure that every animal has enough bait, because what you don't want is for all the bait to be consumed and still have animals left over that will become educated, and also if there's not enough bait, it increases the chance of sublethal dosing and then that learned behaviour never to go back near that bait again sort of thing.
All right, thank you. Any idea on how heavy feral pigs can grow without human interference?
That depends a lot on the area and the resources that are available, I think. I've seen pigs up in some of the largest pigs I've ever seen were up in the Kimberleys, up in northern Western Australia, where they get a pretty regular wet season. So there's often quite a bit of food available, and it might be to do with the domestic breeds that had escaped or been released there in the past. So they were up around about, I think we saw pigs there that may have even reached 150 kilos, but that's above the norm. There's also pigs, in the high country. They also get really quite large, and a few in the channel country as well. I've heard out near Windora that are supposed to get quite big, up over 100 kilograms. But generally, a big boar is around about 80 to 90 kilograms. That's a good sized pig, and females a little bit less.
Okay, thank you. Any idea just roughly on how much HogHopper is, or the HogHoppers are?
I'm not quite sure at the moment. I think this is generally best to get in touch with Animal Control Technologies Australia. I think we might have a link to that site or something come up later. But generally they're around about the $800 mark, I think. That's just off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. And it may, depending probably on the size, so the more you buy, the cheaper they become, I imagine.
Okay. There's a question from Andrew Smith, but his telephone seems to be falling out, so his telephone line must have fallen out, so I'll see if he comes back on in a while. He can ask his question, otherwise he might be able to give you a ring afterwards.
Yeah, sure, that's no problem.
How long or how much rain is required to break down a 1080 pig strength bait?
That's another one I must say I'm not familiar with. I'm not quite sure. I haven't been involved in that research. Normally, it's a relatively quick process though for a lot of other baits and things. But yeah, I can't give a 100% guarantee on that. But it does break down pretty readily in the environment with rainfall, which I guess if it's a concern that you want the bait to last or things like that, that's another bonus of the HogHopper, because it protects the bait from weather. So you can leave it out. If you do get a bit of rain, it's okay. It's not going to bother the bait inside.
Do wild dogs predate feral pigs, and if so, what size of pigs are vulnerable?
Yeah, they do. They do predate feral pigs. They've been found in the diets in feral of wild dogs, I'm pretty sure, in a few studies in Queensland. I think they could. I'm not quite sure on the sizes. I know that small pigs would be no problem at all. But I would imagine that they would even easily take down pigs of size 30 30 kilogram mark. And there's even possibility, I guess, of foxes as well, taking little piglets, from what I've heard, a bit of anecdotal evidence. So that's interesting as well.
That seems to be just about all the questions. Oh, one last one. Why the broad range in population estimates? You said from 3.5 million, I think, to 26. Is that what the range was?
Yeah, it is. It's difficult to say because there are a lot of areas that haven't been tested, so that would probably be to do with habitat matching and where studies have been undertaken thoroughly to work out the density. That's probably how that was worked out. I don't know for sure. But they also say that it can fluctuate significantly according to season. So at the moment, just say in New South Wales, the seasons have been quite good for the last 2 years. So pig numbers are above the average, whereas 10 years prior, it's been drought, so they'll be down at the lower end of the scale. So it's a lot to do with the seasonal conditions, and also to do with the data that was available, I guess, at the time to develop those calculations. It'd be nice to have a new figure, I think, on feral pig abundance in Australia, and I'm not sure if anyone's working on that at the moment, but I think it would be worth looking into.
Okay, that's all the questions we've got today, Jason. So I'd just like to thank Jason Wishart from Invasive Animals CRC for his presentation today. It was very informative, and we covered a lot of the questions, so that was very good to